Welcome everyone to this webinar. We'll just give it a minute or so to let a few more people join. And hopefully you are now all able to see my screen. Yeah, so I can see the numbers still creeping up, so I'll give it to 1 minute past and then we will make a start. Okay, so welcome to this webinar on the updated MCHW, focusing specifically on what designers need to know. So my name is Rebecca Shepherd. I'm from WSP and I'm presenting today on behalf of National Highways Technical Standards Group. In terms of a little bit of housekeeping before we get into it, this session is being recorded and the recording will be shared after the session. If there's any technical difficulties today, we will share the recording regardless. The recording of the webinar will also be available from the Information Hub in due course. There won't be any question and answer in today's webinar. So if you do have any questions about the content of this webinar or about the MCHW or DMRB in general, there is a feedback form on the Standards for Highways website that you can use, which will direct your question to the relevant person. There is also an FAQs page on the Information Hub, which might already answer your question. So have a look there first. In terms of questions that relate to specific contracts, please raise those through your relevant contract and procurement process. And with that, we will make a start. So the MCHW is the Manual of Contract Documents for Highways Works, and it is used by National Highways as the standard suite of specification documents included within construction contracts. There's various roles that interact with the MCHW, and today's webinar is focused specifically on the designers and specifiers role. There will be another webinar on the 8th of July specifically focused on the constructor role. So please do join that if that's applicable to what you do. But today the focus will be on designers and specifiers. In terms of the agenda for today, this webinar should take about an hour. We will start off with a brief introduction to the MCHW and the recent changes. This content was covered in more detail in the webinars that were held between October and January, just after the updated MCHW was published. You can find those webinars on the Information Hub if you would like a bit more background to the changes to the MCHW and what specifically has changed. The bulk of this webinar will be focused on the impact of those changes for designers, and much of the time will be spent doing a kind of practical overview of producing a specification using the updated MCHW. We will have a session towards the end of the webinar where we'll hear from a selection of designers who have used the MCHW already or are familiar with the MCHW from work to date. And so we'll have about 10 minutes of hearing from different designers' experience. And then that will draw the webinar to a close. In terms of the content for today's webinar, much of this has been taken from the MCHW Information Hub. You can access that from if you go onto the Standards for Highways help page, Standards for Highways website, and then on the help pages, you'll find a link to the Information Hub. But I've also put a QR code on screen there, which you can follow if you like accessing things like that. So hopefully by the end of this session, in terms of the objectives for this webinar, you'll have an appreciation of kind of what's changed with the MCHW, where we were and where we are now, how the DMRB and the MCHW link together, particularly now the updated MCHW has been published, the key implications for these changes for the designer, and then specifically how to produce a contract-specific specification using the updated MCHW. So we'll start off with a bit of an introduction of how the MCHW has changed. So before we get into detail, it's worth just defining what we're talking about when we say DMRB and MCHW. So the DMRB is the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges, and that defines the design requirements for every aspect of road infrastructure. The MCHW is the Manual of Contract Documents for Highway Works, and that is the standard suite of specification documents used by National Highways within their construction contracts. National Highways looks after both the DMRB and the MCHW on behalf of all the overseeing organisations in the UK, and these two document sets are both published on the Standards for Highways website. The MCHW was the focus of the recent updates, but alongside that there were various updates made to the DMRB kind of as a consequence of the update to the MCHW. Many of you will be familiar with the DMRB update in 2020 when all of those documents were updated, and the MCHW refresh is a continuation of that wider activity to modernise the whole Standards for Highways set. So before we get into detail, let's recap where we were in April 2020 prior to the MCHW's update. So in 2020, the MCHW comprised 7 volumes, 126 documents, 571 drawings, 3,485 pages, and these were all published in PDF. On average, these documents were over 11 years old, and they all required review, so some of that editorial review, some of them required technical updates, some of them needed to be withdrawn. Beyond age, there was notable inconsistencies in the style, formatting and presentation of requirements. And with no templates for developing the contract-specific specifications, these varied widely in structure and quality, which made it difficult to ensure clarity and uniformity across projects. So the context on this slide underscores the importance of the work that was undertaken to modernise the MCHW. It wasn't just to tidy up legacy content, but it was also to create this coherent, accessible and future-ready framework for delivering world-class highways. So where are we now? So that was where we were. Where are we now? Today, the MCHW has been transformed into a modern, streamlined resource. So it now comprises of 3 document sets with 95 documents and 2,800 pages of fully digitalised content. And these are all available in HTML format, which makes them easier to access and navigate on the Standards for Highways website. The content is now fully up to date, so it's aligned with current industry practice standards and, importantly, DMRB design rules. And we've also established consistency in style, format and the presentation of requirements across the whole document set. And national variations are provided in line at the point at which they're applicable, rather than in national annexes at the back of the documents. And then finally, in addition, templates for contract specifications can now be downloaded from the Standards for Highways website, and that offers greater clarity and, in the long term, efficiency in project delivery. And those templates and the preparation of contract specifications is what we'll be focusing on today. So in terms of an overview of the key changes that were made to the MCHW, if you've joined previous webinars, this slide will look familiar. So there's been the restructuring of the document set, there's the new document style, the introduction of the templates to create the contract specifications, the introduction of country-specific versions. So when you go on the Standards for Highways website, you'll see you're prompted to ask whether you're operating in England, Wales, Scotland or Northern Ireland. The updates that have been made to align the DMRB and the MCHW so they operate as a coherent document set, and then the selected updates to technical content. And we're going to focus on the impacts of these changes for designers. We won't go through all of these in detail, that was covered on the previous webinar, but I will talk through the updated structure because that is one of the most noticeable changes, and we need to have the terminology correct for the rest of the webinar. So in the old world, the MCHW contained 7 volumes, and the updated MCHW contains 3 sets of documents. The new specification for highway works draws primarily from Volume 1, and that covers the constructor requirements and is used at the construction stage of the project. The instructions for specifiers, which is analogous to the old Volume 2, is used at the contract preparation stage of the project and provides instructions on how to produce a contract-specific specification. In addition, content relevant to designers in the old Volume 2 has been updated and moved to the DMRB as applicable to provide the design rules. Now, a quick note on Volume 3, because this has been asked about quite a bit. This is the drawings or the highways construction details. So all the drawings in Volume 3, all the content of Volume 3 was reviewed as part of the MCHW refresh programme. And relevant content has been transferred to either the DMRB or the specification for highway works as applicable as requirements or figures. So the drawings of Volume 3 are no more, but the requirements or figures have been transferred to either the DMRB or the specification for highway works. And on the MCHW Information Hub, there is a table showing where the content from each drawing has moved to. So I'd recommend referring to that table on the Information Hub if you want to work out where a specific highway construction detail has been moved to, or whether it's been removed. And then finally, Volume 4, this is the basis for the new method of measurement document, method of measurement for highway works, and there are 50 of these method of measurement documents. So the old Volume 4 has been split up into these documents. 44 of these relate to the corresponding specification for highway works documents, and then there are 6 standalone method of measurement documents. So just to illustrate what that structure looks like in practice, here is an example showing the 3 MCHW documents from the road layout discipline. So we've got the specification for highway works, the instructions for specifier, and the method of measurement. So the specification for highway works document, the first C prefixes that it's part of the civils discipline. The second C prefix means that it is a constructor requirement. And then the digits denote it the unique document and that it's part of the road layout topic. The instructions for specifiers document is prefix CP, with the P indicating it's part of the contract preparation set, so part of the instructions for specifier, and then the method of measurement documents are related to the relevant specification for highway works document. The document numbering matrix that I've just mentioned there, you can find that on the Standards for Highways website, and that covers both the MCHW and the DMRB. So in terms of the implementation of the MCHW, the updated document set was published in September, and contracts let after that date are implementing the updated documents. And that's that approach to adopting the updated published standards remains consistent with normal practice. There are detailed implementation requirements that are found in GP 110, which is the new introduction to the MCHW. And those implementation requirements do include the option for overseeing organisations to not use the updated MCHW for a project that is advanced in its design stage, where to do so would cause significant cost and time implications. So that's reviewed on a project basis. So that does mean that we are in a bit of transition period at the moment. So we've got projects that were let prior to September that are using the older version of the MCHW, as well as projects that were advanced in the design stage in September. But new projects are starting to use the updated MCHW. So we will have this bit of a transition period for a while yet. And then the final slide in this section, where do you find the MCHW documents? So these are found on the Standards for Highways website. And you can see a screenshot there, which is what will greet you when you go onto the Standards for Highways website. So we'll now move on to discuss how those updates to the MCHW impact on you as designers. So although the MCHW is a constructor stage set of documents, the changes have several implications for designers. So in the updated framework, as I've talked through on the earlier slide, design requirements have now all been placed in the DMRB. So that means some of the content that you previously would have found in Volume 2 in the Notes for Guidance has been moved to the DMRB. And instead, the MCHW, the Specification for Highway Works, focuses on clear, unambiguous construction requirements rather than restating the design intent. The other change that will impact you as designers is that contract-specific appendices have been replaced by work-specific requirements, so that's what WSR stands for, and templates for those work-specific requirements are now available, and they're populated using the information derived directly from the design outputs. So there's a direct link from the DMRB design outputs to the work-specific requirements required in the MCHW, and we'll see that in more detail on later slides. And finally, there have been some technical updates to requirements, and these have been made to bring the MCHW in line with current industry standards and best practice. So there's also been an intentional shift where appropriate towards performance requirements to unlock innovation, and that might result in a shift in your approach to design as well. But fundamentally, the role of the designer is unchanged. You'll continue to produce design outputs, and you'll continue to want to communicate those design outputs to the contractor through those work-specific requirements so that your design gets constructed. So all MCHW documents have been reviewed to ensure they provide up-to-date technical requirements, reflecting latest standards and industry practice. And that means that has resulted in several updates to the DMRB as well. And this updated approach is so that the DMRB tells designers what to design and what outputs to produce, and the MCHW tells constructors what to build and how compliance is measured. That has resulted in this update to the MCHW and the shift of design requirements to the DMRB has resulted in 15 new DMRB documents being created and 52 DMRB documents being updated to align with the content of the MCHW. And this is all to create this golden thread of information from the DMRB and the associated design outputs through to those work-specific construction requirements, and then onwards to as-built information and documentation. So a clear flow of information from designers through to constructors. And so then, with that direct link from the DMRB design outputs to the work-specific requirement templates, you will see that many of the DMRB documents have been updated to make this link clearer. So to illustrate this on the screen here, we have TD 501, which is the DMRB document for road lighting design. And you can see clause 6.6 lists the design outputs, and those relate to what is then required in TC 501, the work-specific requirement. There's a table there which the design outputs need to be inputted into there. So this is just to illustrate that thread of information. So the DMRB flowing through to the work-specific requirements in the MCHW and onwards to as-built information. And then finally, there have been some technical updates to requirements. So these have been made to bring the MCHW in line with current industry standards and best practice. And there's also been that intentional focus on performance requirements to unlock innovation. You'll notice in the MCHW a intentional focus on verification and documentation requirements. So as a designer, you may need to be thinking a bit more explicitly about not only what is required to realise your design intent, but also how that will be verified and documented. So in terms of the technical changes by documents or by discipline, you'll find a list of key changes by document on the MCHW Information Hub under the What Has Changed section. We won't be covering each of the disciplines in detail in this webinar, but there have been some discipline-led presentations and webinars on the discipline-specific changes. Where there is published discipline-specific guidance, that will be included on the Information Hub. So, for example, after the Earthworks conference last year, the geotechnical team in National Highways have produced a guidance note covering the update of the documents relating to the design and construction of geotechnical activities. And that guidance note is available from the Geotechnics page on the Information Hub. So that was a little bit of an introduction of the impact of the changes to the MCHW on designers. And we'll now move on to cover how you go about producing a specification. So before we get into the detail, we're just going to start with a reminder of how the MCHW fits into the contract specification. So the contract specification is formed by the specification for highway works alongside the compiled work-specific requirements. The work-specific requirements may refer to contract drawings or models, alongside other content such as quality documents, environmental content, etc., and that forms the contract scope. The final type of contract documents you would have are things like conditions of contracts and pricing documents, and that latter making use of the method of measurement for highway works where applicable. Now, focusing back on the contract specification and the work-specific requirements, the instructions for compiling these are provided in the instructions for specifier document, which have corresponding work-specific requirement templates which are used to develop the work-specific requirements. So where does the DMRB come into this? So the DMRB provides requirements and advice which is used to develop design outputs, and it is these design outputs which are used to populate the work-specific requirements. So that diagram on the screen there shows you kind of how the MCHW relates to the contract specification. So we understand that the specification for highway works alongside the work-specific requirements form the contract-specific specification. So how do we go about preparing that contract-specific specification, which is a bit of a mouthful? So the general requirements for the preparation of this specification have not changed, but the contract-specific appendices have been replaced by work-specific requirements. And we've already mentioned that there are templates within which those work-specific requirements need to be captured. The instructions for specifiers document provide a standardized approach. They instruct how and where project-specific requirements may be added to the work-specific requirement templates, but they do not define the what. That comes from the design outputs. Over the next few slides, we'll go through the stages of preparing contract-specific specifications, covering the role of the specifier, identifying which work-specific requirement templates need to be completed, the compilation of these, and preparation of these for dissemination. The next few slides are more of the theory, and then we will have some worked examples where we'll look through some practical things you might be doing when you're compiling these work-specific requirement templates. So we'll start with the role of the specifier. So in short, the role of the specifier is to collate the project-specific contract specification and transfer the design outputs to the work-specific requirements. So in theory, if the design outputs are clearly communicated, the specifier could be separate from the designer, but in practice it's recognised it's very likely to be the same person or organisation. The role of the specifier is defined in GP 110, and the main responsibilities are that they shall select the relevant work-specific requirements, complete the work-specific requirements using the design outputs, and compile them using the work-specific requirement templates. And we'll run through those now. So the first activity is to identify which work-specific requirements are needed for a given contract. There are 4 mandatory work-specific requirements that are required for all contracts, and these come from GC 110, which is the introduction to the specification for highway works, and these are listed on screen. They cover key information that that is applicable for all schemes. So firstly, the national version of the specification for highway works that's being used. So you've got, there are 4 versions available, one for each of the UK overseeing organisations. So you need to define which one is applicable. So for national highways, that version would be England. And then you need to state which version of the specification for highway work document is relevant and list the work-specific requirements that are being used for the specific contract. In the second one, in WSR 002, you define who the overseeing organisation is for the particular contract, along with all the parties that have delegated functions. So for NEC contracts, the instruction is to make reference to the contract data part 1 to define who undertakes the role of project manager and supervisor, for example. In the third WSR, in number 3, you would list all the contract drawings and or models to bring those into the contract. And finally, in the fourth one, you would set the date for reference documents. So reference documents include things like British, European, international standards. You need to define the date on which they are, the applicable date for those standards, in case they are updated during the time your contract is live. So in addition to those 4 mandatory WSRs, which will be needed for all contracts, there are then the specific work-specific requirements that are relevant to the scheme or the works planned. So for example, earthworks if you're doing earthworks, road lighting if you're doing road lighting, and so on. So before we get into talking through how to compile the work-specific requirements, where do we get them from? They are available to download from the Standards for Highways website, and they are with the corresponding instructions for specifiers document. If you're looking on the specification for highway works document, you won't find them. They are under the instructions for specifier document, so CP 110 rather than CC 110, and you'll find them in the additional documents section. So that's if you want to download just one. You are able to batch download them, and there's guidance for how to do that on the Standards for Highways help pages. So over the next few slides, we'll do a step-by-step overview of completing the work-specific requirements templates, and then we'll go through some worked examples of scenarios you might encounter. The content on these slides will be new for most of you, and it will make most sense when you are actually populating one yourself. So if you do need to refer to any of this content in future, all these figures on the next few slides have been taken from the Information Hub, so you can access them there for a refresher when you are actually completing one of these. So you've identified your relevant work-specific requirement templates, you've downloaded them from the website. What do you do next? So the first thing is to simplify your life. You delete any work-specific requirement template tabs that are not relevant to your scheme, and then you populate the ones that are relevant. There's 2 types of content you might be populating. You might be populating schedules or tables, or you might be populating statements. So for the tables, for the schedules, you'll find the instructions as to what to populate in red below. Please delete any red content before you issue it as part of the contract. Those are the instructions for specifiers. And then for the statements, you'll find placeholder text in blue, and it's only that placeholder text that should be updated following the instructions for specifiers. And so that placeholder text needs to be deleted or overwritten as applicable. As you're populating your work-specific requirement template, you'll need to identify the purpose of each row, and we'll see this in more detail in the practical examples. But in the purpose column, what you'll do is you'll find a drop-down list which you'll need to complete for each work-specific requirement line item. So that includes requirement, so that's the default. Work-specific requirement is a requirement for your contract, so if you're just using it as normal, it's a requirement. Continuation, that would be used if a single requirement's too long to fit into a cell, not to be used for an additional requirement that has its own category. And then you have your departure options, so where you want to change some of the standard clauses. So you might cancel You might have cancelled requirements, additional requirements, or substituted requirements. So cancelled is where the requirement is no longer used, and you would then strike out the requirement. Additional is where there are requirements additional to those in the specification for highway works and not otherwise covered in the work-specific requirements. And then substituted, where you've overwritten or substituted a requirement with a new requirement. And we'll see an example of that in a few slides' time. And finally, you might have a work-specific requirement that's not applicable, and that's used, for example, where you have a specification for highway work clause that says, do this unless otherwise stated in the WSR. And in that case, if you didn't want to state otherwise, that would be not applicable. In the right-hand corner, you'll see a note on the difference between not applicable and blank content. And this is because this has been a question that's been raised. So if it is not applicable, in the way I've just described, you tag it as such to show it's purposely not considered. And then you would leave the work-specific requirement blank. So if there's placeholder text, you would just leave the placeholder text, but you've marked it as not applicable to show you've done that on purpose. But if there's no information to be conveyed, for example, because it's a contractor design item, you'd leave it blank, but you wouldn't mark it as not applicable because it could remain applicable for your contract. And then if you have an entire tab that's not applicable, remember that you should delete that tab. So we've completed the work-specific requirement template tabs. What's left to do? So if you are proposing a departure, so those are those additional, cancelled or substitute requirements, you need to complete the departures process following your overseeing organisation's process. So for National Highways, this is DAS. A departure is any modification to the MCHW. So that's those additional, substitute or cancelled requirements, and they need to go through the departures approval system or equivalent. Once the departure has been approved through the departures process, then you bring it into contract through the work-specific requirement template. Putting them on the work-specific requirement template does not automatically trigger the departures process. You have to do that separately. And then there is a dedicated departures tab to identify these departures, and that's the CR, SR and AR tab that you will see in the work-specific requirement templates. There's a space for scheme level departures and element-specific departures, and we'll see in the worked example practical uses of this tab. And then before we go into the worked example, one final slide here on drafting rules. So in many cases, you won't be drafting new requirements, you'll just be populating them with work-specific information. But in some cases, for example, some of the statements, or if you're adding or substituting requirements, you may draft some. The work-specific requirements are part of a contract and therefore they must be contractually sound. And the drafting rules on screen are the same drafting rules used for drafting the specification for highway works. And a key point is there's only two verb forms that are appropriate: shall, which is for an overseeing organisation's specific requirements, or must for legislative requirements. And you should be completely unambiguous. So there might be types of content you're tempted to include, but they may not belong in a specification. So things like advisory clauses, background information, vague expressions, or contractually ambiguous expressions. So we'll now move on to a worked example. So on the screen here is an example specification document. Or rather, because it includes the specifier instructions, these SI clauses, it is the corresponding instructions for specifier documents. This is a fictional specification for highways works documents on screen. It says CC 601, but it's not CC 601. It's a fictional document to illustrate the different real-life scenarios you may encounter. So the different scenarios we will consider over the next couple of slides are identified in those green boxes. So they are: I'd like to cancel a requirement and not substitute it. I'd like to cancel a requirement and substitute it. I'd like to cancel a requirement, not substitute it, but there's also an associated work-specific requirement. I'd like to follow this requirement, but the associated work-specific requirements not applicable. I'd like to keep this requirement, but substitute the work-specific requirement statements. I'd like to keep this requirement, but substitute the work-specific requirement schedule because I need to add a new column. I'd like to add a new requirement entirely that is relevant to this topic. And then at the bottom, number 8 is I'd like to add a new requirement, but it's part of an aspect that's not otherwise covered, and there's therefore no associated work-specific requirement tab for this. So we'll now look through how we might go about these. So we'll start on the Departures tab because examples 1, 2 and 3 relate to wanting to cancel requirements. So remember, if you are using the Departures tab, you need to have first followed the departures approval process to get your departures approved. So item 1 is a straightforward cancellation. So under the cancelled requirements section of the work-specific requirement template on the CR/SR/AR tab, you would add a new row, add the relevant specification for highways works clause, and simply state delete this requirement. Section 3 is similar. It sits under the cancelled requirement, and in this case, because it's got a work-specific requirement, you'd say delete this requirement and associated work-specific requirement, and we'll see what that looks like on the work-specific requirement tab on the next slide. Item 2 relates to a substitution, so this lives under the substitute requirements section. So same rules apply with adding a new row, identifying the specification for highway works clause reference, and in this case you would say delete this requirement and insert the new requirement given in, and then you would reference the relevant work-specific requirement tab. So in this fictional example, it's CC601 WSR 009. A key point to flag here is this part of the Departures tab is very succinct. You're not adding your substitute requirements here, you're just identifying that they will be substituted. And that's because wherever possible, requirements relating to the same topic belong together on the same tab. So we'll now move on to look at that tab we just mentioned, CC601 WSR 009. So on the right of the screen here, you've got the section specific tab, which is where you would add in your work specific requirements. So we'll start with item 3. This has been cancelled. So you would find the relevant work specific requirement. You would set the purpose to cancelled, delete the WSR number because it's no longer used, and then strike out the work specific requirement. So that's how you deal with cancelled requirements. For item 4, the core clause 9.4 is applicable, but it includes the phrase unless otherwise stated. So in this case, we don't want to state otherwise. So we find the work specific requirement, we set it to not applicable, and we just leave the placeholder text as it is, and we do nothing to it. So that's how you deal with not applicable work specific requirements. Looking down the page, clause 9.4 we're leaving alone, and there's no associated work specific requirement, but clause 9.6 we want to replace or substitute the work specific requirement statement. So in this case, the downloaded template will already include the existing statement, and to substitute these, you first write substituted, so you put substituted in the purpose column, and then you delete the entire statement and replace it with your substituted clause. So you're setting the purpose of substituted to flag that you've changed the entire statement rather than just the placeholder text. This substitution is a departure from standard because you're doing something different from what was instructed. You're replacing the whole whole requirement rather than just the bit that's been left open for the work specific requirements. So therefore, that needs to be identified on the Departures tab, and we'll see that on the next slide. Item 6 is similar, although this relates to a schedule, a table, rather than a statement. So in this case, again, identified the purpose as substituted, and then the whole table has been replaced with the table that's desired. Then the final item on this slide is item 7, which is where you want to add in an additional requirement that is relevant to this section or topic. So in this case, it belongs on the section specific tab. So you would identify the purpose as additional and then add in a work specific requirement reference. In terms of the specification for highways works reference, there's no associated clause. So you can't reference a clause, you just reference the document, but it's the work specific requirement reference that would be used if you needed to reference this requirement. And then you would write out your requirement. If you need more than one line, this is an example of where you would use the continuation purpose. So we'll now move on to the final slide where we'll return to the Departures tab. So items 5, 6, 7 and 8 all involve departures because they relate to substituted or additional requirements. So for item 5, we are substituting the work-specific requirement statement. We wrote the new statement on the section specific work-specific requirement tab, and we don't need to repeat that new statement here. Instead, you identify the relevant clause and you say delete these work-specific requirement statements and insert the new statements as given in, and then you would reference that work-specific requirement tab. And you do the same for item 6, which is where you want to substitute the schedule. So you would just say delete this work-specific requirement schedule and insert the new schedule. So this is an illustration of how you keep this tab very succinct. Item 7 relates to the additional requirements which we added on the section specific tab. So in this case, you would just say under additional requirements, add the additional requirements shown in, and then you would reference those work specific requirements that we added on the previous tab. And then the final item 8. So this relates to new requirements that don't belong on any section specific work specific requirement tab. And that's because it is a topic not otherwise covered in the MCHW. So in this case, you would include the requirement on the Departures tab. So you add an appropriate heading for your topic and then add in your requirements as applicable. So that brings us to the end of the worked example, covering different scenarios that you might encounter as you complete the work-specific requirement template. If you need a refresher of any of what I've just gone through, these figures may look familiar, and that's because they are the same as those on the Information Hub. So you can always refer there if you want a recap. For example, if you're trying to do one of these aspects and you can't quite remember exactly how to do it, you can refer to the Hub for detail. So finally, we've got the preparation of work-specific requirement templates for dissemination, and this is when you need to issue these for contract. There's some flexibility in how this is done to suit your project, so you might print your templates to a PDF, not print them at all and issue it as a package of spreadsheets or something else entirely. But whatever you do, you must use the templates and the numbering system, otherwise you run the risk of your contract not being contractually sound. And I'll just briefly run through a few key pointers to bear in mind as you're preparing your contract specific specification for dissemination. So firstly, clarity. Make sure your templates are readable and can be printed in the required format. For example, making sure your text is not hidden in too small cells. You might also want to transpose your tables, particularly those with multiple columns, and then there's an example of how to do that on the Information Hub. Secondly, completeness. So you'll have identified the work-specific requirements that are applicable. Make sure they've all been completed. And then data protection and packaging. So you need to ensure no one can modify the content. There's various ways of doing that. And then you'll need to compile all your work-specific requirement templates into a single file. So that might be a PDF, might be a zip file, might be something else. And finally, you need a process for ensuring quality management. So that includes your quality assurance checks and version controls, and you'd follow your contract quality management system for that. Once downloaded, the templates are just simple spreadsheets. There's no inbuilt functionality on checking and approval in the templates. So after all that compiling of your work-specific requirements, you will have a contract specification which comprises your specification for highway works and your compiled work-specific requirements. So I'm going to stop speaking for a few minutes now, and I'm going to hand over to some designers who've got some practical experience, and they will share their experience and their tips for using the MCHW. If I can press play.
Hi, I'm Eddie Williams from the WSP Newcastle Bridges team. I've recently used the updated MCHW to develop a contract-specific specification for bridge repair works to a concrete crosshead beam. This is my first time creating a specification, and I found it useful that the WSR template guides you on what project-specific information you need to define, even on a smaller package. My main advice would be to make good use of this MCHW information hub. It's really easy to follow, and it helps you understand how everything fits together. The way the documents are structured and linked means that you can move between the specification, the instruction for specifiers, and the WSR templates quite clearly. This makes it easy to identify what you actually need for your scheme, rather than trying to start from scratch.
I've been using the updated MCHW as a specifier, and I'd recommend taking some time to understand the new structure. There's been some big changes with the format of the documents and how information is presented. One change I'd particularly highlight is the change in how testing requirements are communicated to the contractor. So previously you listed all the testing to be carried out in Appendix 1/5, and you listed all the sampling requirements in 1/6. Now all the verification requirements, so testing, monitoring, sampling, etc., are covered within the specific SHW documents rather than there being an overall schedule produced for the works.
Hi, my name is Satyam. I work as an engineer in the local government team. I've been working on carriageway resurfacing schemes. On a recent scheme, I developed a scope using the updated MCHW approach, and I wanted to share a few reflections from that experience. For those who have worked with the previous method, one of the key difference is how the scope is developed. The new approach is more structured and precise. It requires you to refer directly to the relevant documents and build the scope alongside them, rather than relying on copying and pasting clauses. While this takes a bit of adjustment initially, it leads to a much clearer and more consistent output. From the contractor's perspective, this shift may feel difficult at first. Previously, all the information was typically provided in a single Word or PDF document. Now there is a greater reliance on IFS, which means navigating across different documents. This can seem like a little extra effort initially, but it becomes more efficient once you are familiar with the process. From a specifier's point of view, it can also be helpful to see how the final output comes together. While the WSR tables are generally self-explanatory, having a clearer picture of how everything is consolidated and presented to the contractors can make overall approach easier and understandable to adopt. Overall, this has been my experience so far of working with the new MCHW approach. Thank you.
When using the new MCHW, we as designers need to be more structured and intentional in how we communicate our design outputs. The updated DMRB documents give you more guidance on this. Design outputs include drawings, reports, models, and schedules, all of which convey critical information about the design. These need to correspond to the work-specific requirements in the specification. For example, make sure each design element has a unique reference number so that all the requirements for construction, verification, and documentation can be clearly linked back to it. This will ensure that the specifier has everything they need to complete the work-specific requirements accurately and efficiently.
The new MCHW places greater focus on defining the products we specify. So instead of just stating that a product needs to comply with a particular standard, we now also define a list of performance characteristics. This helps ensure that we get a product of sufficient quality. But we also need to make sure that the specification is not so tight that there are no products available. My top tip is to identify a number of products that you would like to be used and then find their declaration of performance, which should be readily available on manufacturers' websites. You can then use these alongside the product standards Annex ZA and provide values for the essential characteristics that are readily achievable. And there is also guidance in the DMRB on how to select these characteristics.
The new MCHW for landscape and ecology is more concise than its predecessor, Series 3000. It removes all reference to long-term maintenance and management, so there is now more clarity that anything relating to maintenance relates to establishment maintenance only. The new MCHW also sets some more rigorous environmental standards for landscape works, requiring the use of peat-free products and biodegradable materials for tree guards, ties and mulch mats.
Hello, I'm Josh. I am a senior bridge engineer working for WSP. I've recently used the updated MCHW to produce a specification for a large multi-year framework commission. I believe that the way that the new specification for highway works and associated work-specific requirement documents are formatted lends itself to more of a project-specific scheme. It's clear that when using the documents, what needs to be specified for the relevant works and where the information should come from. I think the shift towards more of a performance-based requirements will result in more contract responsibility, which then comes with a greater flexibility and potential for innovation on projects. I think the move to the new MCHW format and WSR templates will take some time just to get adjusted to from those who have experience producing specifications. However, I think the layout and the style of the new SHW documents, where there's a clear distinction between product, installation, verification and documentation requirements, provides a more user-friendly approach to specification production for those who are new to the process. I think that there needs to be some more clarity around the approach to departures from standard. So with departures now fully integrated into the WSRs, which will improve traceability and clarity, I do think that there needs to be some more clarification, as there could be some confusion regarding how the departure process is managed. In terms of the production of a framework specification, as I have done, I've found that the vast majority of requirements will be covered at a scheme-specific level, and I believe this is partly due to the shift away from prescriptive requirements to performance-based. And this shift will lead to great integration of the content on a project-by-project basis, and should hopefully result in a reduction in inherited mistakes, formatting errors, missing information, that comes with simply copying and pasting specification appendices from previous schemes, which we saw quite a lot in the past. But all in all, I think that whilst it may take some time to get used to, the overall benefits of the new SHW and WSR formats will be clear to see as we start to see them integrated into our projects.
Great, thank you very much for all of those who took time to share some of their experiences, and I hope that was helpful for you who are listening today as well. So we're into the final part of the presentation where we'll just recap on what we've learnt, but also I'll signpost you to where the available guidance and support is, as well as the route for feedback. So I've mentioned quite a lot throughout this presentation, the information hub. So this has been developed in recognition that this is quite a substantial change for the industry, and National Highways are keen to support the transition. So the information hub is accessible from the Standards for Highways website, and it is a website that covers the essential guidance for the implementation of the updated MCHW. It's focused specifically on that transition to the updated MCHW. In terms of the content on there, we've got an overview of kind of why it's changed, and then more detail on what has changed. And in this section, you'll find the document mapping, which is particularly helpful if you're looking for where kind of documents you've been used to using in the past have gone to, as well as the list of all the MCHW sections. So you can see all the topics that are covered in the MCHW, and the key changes summarised by document. That discipline-specific content is in there. We then got the What Do I Do section, which is where you will find quite a lot of the content that we've covered today. So the How Do I Prepare a Contract Specific Specification, that's got all those figures that we've talked through today, if you would like a recap on them. And then finally, the help and support section. So the recording of this webinar, you'll be able to find in the webinars section there. There's also an existing FAQ page from questions that have been asked in the past, and then do make use of the feedback form if there are any questions that you can't find the answer to on the information hub. Now, we do recognise that people will be coming to the updated MCHW for quite a while yet, given we're in this transition period, and so the Information Hub will remain live for as long as it's needed. So in terms of feedback, if you do have any questions on the updated MCHW or any of the content that was covered in today's webinar, do make use of the feedback form. You'll find that on the Standards for Highways website, and you'll be prompted to select what your feedback relates to, and that will ensure your feedback is directed to the relevant team for response and actions. So please do get in touch. Please do leave your contact details if you specifically if you have a question, because we can't get back in touch with you if you remain anonymous. So that brings us to the end of our session. So hopefully by now you've got an appreciation of where we were and where we are now with the MCHW, the link between the DMRB and the MCHW, and the key implications of the recent changes for designers. And hopefully you've got a better understanding of how to produce the contract specific specification using the updated MCHW. So thank you very much for your time. There's some QR codes on the screen there for the Standards for Highways website, Information Hub and the feedback form. Otherwise, enjoy using the updated MCHW. I hope you don't get too hot this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of your afternoons. Thank you very much.